Hello and welcome to Gym with Gwynne. This week I'm talking about building with Claude. Now, there's a million people online telling you how to use AI, which means it must be very popular. I've not done a blog yet, guys, so 1,000,001, it's okay, right? I feel like it's really important to start this with a little bit of background about myself. So I'm not a software engineer by any stretch of the imaginations, but I'm certainly not a non-technical person. Like, I built apps, I built websites, I built products, virtual products before. I have a decent understanding of the infrastructure that is needed, the security, the considerations. And so when AI does things wrong, I can spot that it's gone wrong. And I think that is a consideration that a lot of people who are watching might not have. And so I'm going to say straight off the bat something that's super obvious, which is that if you don't have that consideration, often there are bugs and workarounds that Claude will suggest, or security issues that you're just not going to be aware of unless you've done things properly. And so instantly my advice to you is that I'm sure there are lots of people who are shipping stuff like fully fledged applications to mobile apps, all this kind of stuff, and I'm sure that they know what they're doing and it's perfectly fine. But there's already been a number of apps that were hacked because they were not built properly. There is still a significant danger in just using AI and relying on it if you don't have a background in coding and you don't have a background in infrastructure, you don't understand what to ask. So do not use it to ship live projects if you are just typing in natural language to and hoping that Claude knows all the answers. It does not know all the answers. I've been building a number of stuff with Claude and it's cool. I love it. And the reason I love it is that there's some stuff that I could build in the past. For example, the signal, I put the link down below. It's just basically a fancy form. It gives you a personalized answer depending on what you put in there. It's not too complicated. It's only 4 questions and an outcome. But what I could build that myself before. But what I probably couldn't do, or would take me a long time to do, was to then connect that to HubSpot, which is a CRM, to automate emails that come afterwards, to give you your responses via email. That would have taken me, half a day to figure out how to do. And now, thanks to Claude and running API calls and all this kind of stuff, I can do it very, very quickly. And so it's really great for that kind of stuff, in plugging together different systems and understanding how to make something in an easy way. Sometimes it will work around and it comes up with an MVP solution that kind of works and it skirts around what you want to do, but it functions. And for a lot of my use cases, that's perfectly fine. And hopefully for a lot of yours as well. But let's start at the beginning. How do you get the most out of Claude? So I'm going to share my screen now. There's a pause there because I was sharing my screen. So the first thing in Claude, if you're not really familiar with it, is these 3 boxes are really, really important before you do anything: files, instructions, and memory. Files is where you can give it context. Files, to me, is the most important thing, depending on on anything that you're building, basically, because context is everything to results. If you can spend 2 or 3 days, and it might really be days, to give Claude the full context of what you want it to do, depending on your use case, of course, then your results will be dramatically better. And that means formulating things in ways that is easy to Claude to read. It means having really well organized documents. It's making sure that everything is nicely labeled so that Claude doesn't do things like you put in a piece of text that says, oh, we can deliver 8 to 12 weeks. And then you ask it to generate some emails and it says in every single email, we deliver in 8 weeks, which, depending on what it is, you might not be able to do. That's a real use case that happened to me. And so think really carefully about, if you were to onboard a new person into your company, what files would you need to do? What is the process that you would normally go through? What are the systems at play that it should consider? How can you label everything so that it will understand. And bear in mind that you can upload quite a lot of files into there. You can have some really chunky stuff in it. I've never got over 50%, but I use more files than most of the people in my company. So I think having good file structure is the number one thing to get the most out of Claude. And it can be examples, writing samples, visual examples of what you're trying to build and the process flow that it might need to go in. And all of these things are online. So if you're building, I don't know, an app, go and find somebody who already has that, find what the process flow is, maybe even use AI to try and figure it out, and then you can give it a better brief. And the second thing is, of course, instructions. This is how it's going to think about things and the rules that you give it. And again, just take your time to make sure that whatever your instructions are, they're really well thought out. And this will also massively minimize the amount of back and forth that you have with Claude when you're building things. Now, I know that that's super obvious and most of you will already know this, but still, I think these are the two things that you can do that will make the biggest difference to building something that is consistent, that is in your industry, in your language, in your company style. The more instructions you can give it, the absolute better. So what's next? Well, you're going to start building things with Claude. And it's really important that you think about what the end outcome is and what do you really need. Give you an example. I was thinking about an investment product recently, and I know that really what I want to do is I want to pull live investment data, stock market data from an API and get those numbers up on a screen. But in order to do that, I need to establish an ETL process. So I'm extracting that information, I'm storing it in a warehouse, I'm putting it to a front end, and then the front end will develop the numbers. I don't need AI for that, but I don't really want to go through all that rigmarole. I want to build something really quick and easy, and I wanted to see if I could use AI for that. And that's where the thinking needs to start. The thinking is, well, if I did this properly, what do I need? How often do I need the data? What am I building? How often will it refresh? If it's a standalone product where it's always going to use the same information, it's not going to have to learn and adapt and all that kind of stuff, then that's much better, because if I was to use Claude on its own for that, then in theory, what I would have to do is I'd have to still pull from that API, but I would have to update every single company record every single time something updated, which is not really a good idea if I'm building that kind of product, which is reliant on fresh data for it to be useful. And so the starting point is, of course, first principles. What's the easiest way to get this information, and is Claude the right tool to do that? It might not be the right tool if you need live data, if there's going to be something that pulls and the information extracts. What you will develop with Claude in that case is a point in time. You also need to think about the systems and tools that you're going to be using. Claude cannot connect to everything, okay? So like we use HubSpot. It can connect to HubSpot, or I can send my signals back to HubSpot. And so, for example, we have a cold email that goes out. If you click on that 4 times, I think it's actually 3 times, I get a notification to say, Oliver, follow this person up. They've connected 3 times. They seem pretty interested. And that works through an API call in the backend system. But there's a lot of CRM systems that Claude doesn't work with. So again, if I wanted to do the same thing, maybe I would have it email me instead directly to say, this is how that would work. In order to set up that system of cold emailing, I couldn't actually use HubSpot. It would not send emails through HubSpot. The API doesn't let us do that today. And so it had to go through our regular email system. I had to set up a webhook to understand if people had clicked and opened. Actually, I found that the click rates in HubSpot are not very good, by the way. My cold emails were getting 15% clicks, but my HubSpot emails to warm contacts were getting like 1%. So that was an interesting thing to find out. But I guess my point is that in that system, I have gone around what I should be doing, which is using HubSpot as my source of truth. I've gone around that, but I've then figured out a new way to make sure that all of the files within HubSpot or the records within HubSpot are up to date. But again, think about the tools and start asking Claude, hey, how can I do this? What are the tools that you would recommend? These are what I'm normally using. And in a lot of cases, your company might just say, no, 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 you have to use HubSpot to email, or you have to use this. And so you might not be able to work around it with the ease that I can, because, I have the freedom to be able to go and buy a domain just for emails and set that up and all this kind of stuff where it doesn't really matter. And so think about the tools that you're using and the outcomes that you want there. The next thing is a section that I want to call, what do people complain about when they start to use Claude? First thing is inconsistency across sessions. So the same prompt on 2 different days can produce meaningfully different quality, which makes it hard to build repeatable processes without guardrails. And you can't really put the guardrails in. Like, having a project is a much better way of doing that than having standalone chats. But certainly at a certain point, when you've done 100 messages, it needs to concatenate the chat, so it asks you to do a new chat, and then you're starting again from scratch. And that's really dangerous. And so you have to kind of get to an answer in the shortest amount of chats possible. And bear in mind, I'm on the paid version. I'm sure on the free version, it would be even less than that. Over-engineering and under-engineering with little in between. So left unsupervised, it tends to either go towards like needlessly elaborate things or like a brittle shortcut, rarely in the middle. And so an experienced engineer would probably pick that middle point by instinct, and I'm lucky that I have enough knowledge that I know what the middle point is. But as I was saying, if you can give it the context of what systems you can use, it can give you the, okay, you're going to have to do this and this and this and this and this to get to this, or you can do something much simpler, and the simple answer is normally the best. Context is lost on long projects. So anything spanning multiple sessions needs a human to actively carry that state forward, or you spend the first 10 minutes of every session reestablishing what you're doing and why, which is really annoying. But the biggest complaint is sometimes it does the wrong thing, and it really doesn't like it. It doesn't tell you that it's done the wrong thing. So I'll give you a good example. The other day I was building something, and I said, okay, I want to add in these metrics to this MVP I was building, but only tell me what metrics I can 100% do with the data I've got. And it gave me a list. And then it said, oh, by the way, all these metrics are empty because the data wasn't there. And I was like, excuse me, Claude, you told me I could do this. I specifically asked you. And then what it had done is it had built something that didn't incorporate its own advice into it. And so we had to go back and do that again. So my advice here is, if you notice that Claude is making you download files so that you can build a folder, and then it tends to run things in terminal, and you find that that didn't quite work, I'm going to have to download something else and do something else. If you find that it is doing that 2 or 3 times, probably on the second time, that's the point to stop Claude and say, hey, Claude, can I just double check that you know what you're doing? Because it seems like you're having to re-engineer this, or you haven't quite got this right. And normally it will admit, oh, you're right to flag this. Let's just go back and think about what I've done. And we're all guilty of doing that sometimes, building something and it doesn't work and needing to test and try things. But I'm sure a lot of us who have used Claude and other similar systems, you get to the 7th iteration and you're like, Claude, I already told you to do this, and now you've forgotten about this and you've not done this, and it gets really, really annoying. And so thinking of the concatenation of the results, you need to give it feedback and be really deliberate about your feedback and say, you were supposed to do this, you didn't do this, and always suggest back to it the best ways of you handling this. And so that's another thing. Do you know how you would normally do this thing? I'll give you an example. I was designing something with a UX very specific, and Claude is not good at UX. I wanted a rough texture in my example. And so it said, hey, don't worry about it. I can make a rough texture. I can run this script. It could not. It was giving me square boxes. It looked terrible, honestly. I will put on screen what it did, but it was not good. And so I said to it, hey, Claude, that's not really what I want. What if I upload a PNG, I host it on the website, you can then pull that into the HTML file, and we'll do it that way. Because I knew that that's something they could do. And it basically meant that this tool was writing on top of my image, which is a bit dangerous because it needed to fit a certain space. But that worked really nicely. It meant that I personally designed this rough edge that was exactly what I wanted and the colors I wanted, all this kind of stuff. I had a particular image. I didn't have to hosted it, and then it does the little bit that changes on top of that. So that was a really nice way of doing things. So always think about, if Claude is going to suggest a really long way of doing things, which it often does, how else could you do it? What's a really simple solution? And ask it, hey, what if we did this instead? What if I upload this? What if I design this for you? Because it's not good at visual design. What else do people complain about with Claude? I think that there's a trust problem. People either overtrust it and then they ship bugs, or they undertrust it and they manual check everything that was fine, which kind of wastes your speed advantage that they came for. And so the collaboration has to be kind of right in the middle. The first thing is obviously like test whatever it makes to extinction, like make sure multiple people are testing what you're doing. Obviously, this is especially true if you're trying to build like a data product or something agentic, something with an LLM. You know, ask the question 5 different ways on 5 different days. Get your entire team to ask the same thing. Try, just randomly typing and put loads of typos in there. Does it give you the same answer? Try swearing at it, seeing what that does. Just tell it randomly that it's wrong, even if it's right. And do you get the same answer? Can it be challenged in that way? Because that is a real use case of how people will use these tools. And so try and use the tool how people will use it, test it to destruction, and any bugs, make sure you get really detailed logs, take screenshots, go back to Claude and say, you haven't done this again. We don't have any like live numbers that we can look at a gospel of how many things are being built and how many people are now using AI to develop. Anthropic's own usage and revenue figures for coding specific products have grown very sharply, and that is probably good evidence that it does make you faster, more than marketing suggests. Several studies through 2025 found that experienced developers sometimes slower or on unfamiliar code bases despite feeling faster, which is its own useful lesson about trusting your own instincts here. So I think it's an important note there that experienced developers are still looking at this and being wary. I think most people are wanting to validate that, making sure it's robust. Sometimes the code is not good. There was another tool I was testing out recently, and every single time the code would be different when I was asking the same query and I was asking it to generate some SQL, and it just couldn't quite do that. And that's very, very dangerous. And so you have to treat Claude like it's capable, junior, and read everything. It's read everything, but it remembers nothing. Give it the context that you would give a new hire. Review its output the way that you would review a new hire, warmly, without assuming that there's incompetence there, but making sure that the job has been done properly. Only ship things that are not security focused. So probably you shouldn't be doing things to take in people's personal data and then not hosted properly. Ask Claude if you were doing it properly, how would you do it? That might be a good way of doing it. And think about the simplest way of doing things at every step. When I'm building something with Claude, I like to bounce ideas off of it, because then that can give you a really good indication, because Claude will always steer you towards what it knows typically. And so I'm thinking about doing this. These are the things that I want to show. What are your ideas? What are your suggestions? Okay, you've suggested something, you can probably do that thing. Then you give it the tools that you're using, the practical implications. How often do things need to be updated? What's the user interface? And then you're going to go through iterations. Iterations is the most important thing. You're going to go through several different versions of this tool, and every time you need to go check it, make sure it works, feedback until you get to a state that you finally got a working product. And it can be really frustrating. Honestly, I've been swearing at the machine where I've just thought, you told me to do this thing and now it's not working. We've been working on this for 3 or 4 hours and you've taken me on completely the wrong answer. And that's why it's really important, where you feel like you're not really making progress, especially if you don't understand what it's suggesting, that you stop, you ask it to verify its own thinking and move from there. Oh, and when you're done building, it's really important that you document the process that you've been with, because too often you build something, you and Claude together, and then it lives in your head how all the system works. So make sure you've documented it and make that documentation so that somebody new can follow the same steps that you have, and they should reproduce the same outcome. That's really, really important. I think coding with Claude is really cool. I really enjoy it. Um, I think it has definitely lowered the barrier of skill. I don't think it's erased it entirely. I don't think that if I didn't know something about how technology works, that I could ship things based purely on text. And the scarce input now is going to be taste. You know, having a taste, having an understanding of how things work, having an opinion and a vision becomes more and more important, because when everybody can bring things to life, the creative input and the output and knowing how to build things becomes more and more important, which is great for somebody like me, where I'm a semi-skilled person, but I have a great eye for strategy and implementation and what things should look like at the end of the day. So these have been some somewhat generic advice about how to use Claude for building things. Remember that your prompt library is your actual MP. The code is almost disposable now. There's reusable specification in most of the code that you build and what you ask it. And so what you built, anybody can copy that in an afternoon now, but the thoughts that you got used to get there are the what's really important. Thanks very much for watching, and tune in next week for some more Gin with Gwynne.